Israel has launched a ground invasion of southern Lebanon, just 3 days after assassinating Hezbollah's leader, Hassan Nasrallah. Hello and welcome to the Nexus. Today we're looking specifically at Israel's weapons, including the bunker busters used to assassinate Hezbollah's leader, Hassan Nasrallah. Those bombs, plus the jets that delivered them, are amongst the most sophisticated weapons in the region. So too are the systems used to counter Iran's ballistic missile attack. Most of those weapons are, in large part, paid for and manufactured by Israel's greatest ally, the United States. Coming up, we'll be hearing from a panel of military and legal experts. Also ahead, how much do these weapons cost? What does America get in return?
Why is the U.S. financing Israel's military in its wars when it not only hurts our own country, but when millions of Israelis are having better standard of living than millions of Americans?
Plus, Israel wants more of America's biggest bombs. So why is Biden holding back?
Civilians have been killed in Gaza as a consequence of those bombs.
And finally, who's making money out of all this carnage?
So right now, they have built this great revolving door between the Department of Defense and the big contractors. And they want that revolving door to keep spinning.
But first, let's look at the US hardware that was used by Israel to assassinate Hezbollah's leader on Friday.
Israel's strike on Hezbollah's headquarters in Beirut.
Nasrallah was at Hezbollah's underground headquarters, one of several sites targeted in a series of massive explosions.
The bombs reportedly used to assassinate Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah were dropped by Israel, but they were born in the USA. The Blue 109 bomb with JDAM guidance kit weighs over 900 kilograms. The JDAM kit allows the bomb to be targeted with precision. Produced by Boeing, they cost at least $50,000 each, and an estimated 85 of them were dropped to target Nasrallah in Beirut. These so-called bunker busters are designed to penetrate hard surfaces or deep underground. They can get through reinforced concrete of almost 2 meters. Only once inside a building or bunker do they explode. Nasrallah and other Hezbollah leaders were killed while meeting in a hidden bunker under the suburbs of southern Beirut. 4 large buildings were leveled and the devastation spread over an area of 300 meters. Videos from Israel showed at least 8 F-15I jets taking off before the attack on Nasrallah. They were carrying the Blue 109 bombs. Israel's F-15I Ram fighters have a longer range than its other advanced jets at over 4,400 kilometers and a maximum speed around 3,000 kilometers per hour. They've been used against Syria and Gaza as well as Lebanon. This version is made especially for the Israeli Air Force by US defense giant Boeing. Just another example of how Israel's war on Lebanon and Gaza could not happen without Washington supplying the means. Back in May, there was a rare interruption in the flow of arms between the two allies.
President Biden is signaling a major shift in policy.
A blunt warning from President Biden to Israel.
The US stopped deliveries of the Blue 109s as well as smaller 220 kilogram bombs over fears of how Israel might use them.
I made it clear that if they go into Rafah, I'm not supplying the weapons that have been used historically to deal with Rafah.
Washington expressed concern that Israel's dropping these huge bombs in built-up areas of Gaza and causing massive civilian casualties. However, while the US is still not sending any Blue 109s for now, since it has supplied over 13,000 of them since 2012, Israel should have plenty available. There are reports of tensions between the two allies over Israel's tactics and even talk of Netanyahu's frosty relations with Biden. However, since October 7 of last year, the numbers are clear. The Biden administration has intensified its military support for Israel. It has been sending 1 or 2 shipments of weapons every day since the war on Gaza began. In August, the US approved a new $20 billion arms package, with Israel now fighting on multiple fronts, including assassinations in Iran, preparing a ground offensive into Lebanon, launching airstrikes on Yemen, and still causing carnage in Gaza. It needs those US weapons to keep coming.
Okay, let's bring in our guests now, and we have David Des Roches, a former official at the Pentagon, and Luigi Daniele, an international humanitarian and criminal law expert. Welcome to the program, both of you. David, if I could start with you. These blue 109s, they are enormous. They do enormous damage over a very wide area. Was it really the right choice to use in Beirut, in a suburb?
Yeah, so good question. So the Blue 109 is a penetrating warhead. So most conventional airdrop munitions actually are designed to explode and maximize the explosion over a wide area or maximize the dispersion of shrapnel. The Blue 109, about 3/4 of it is steel. It's designed to penetrate using the power of gravity, drop from a great height, into that, and then about 25% of it explodes to destroy an underground bunker. So given the target, the nature of the target, that probably is the proper munition. If you look at photographs, obviously the building that the bunker was built on top of was destroyed, and there was damage to the buildings around it, but those buildings were not destroyed. And if you compare the damage with the penetrating rounds used here versus when Israel last was there in 2006, the scale of destruction is far limited. So I think given the technology and the choice of Hezbollah to put their command bunker underneath an apartment building, that's probably about the best result that can be expected.
Luigi, do you accept that explanation?
I disagree, unfortunately, because from the point of view of international humanitarian law, you cannot target a lawful military objective if you know that you are going to cause disproportionate harm to civilians. Unfortunately, this attack wasn't preceded by advance warnings, and the weapon was of a nature to cause widespread destruction in civilian objects, full of civilians at the moment of the attack. I think the IDF themselves estimate that 300 civilians at least have been killed in the attack. If we compare this with the past, this is much higher than the threshold of tolerance for civilian harm that the United States Army itself determined as acceptable.
David, the problem is, of course, giving a warning might have meant Hezbollah's leader running away.
Exactly. So the key concept that Luigi mentioned is disproportionate, and I think that's where we argue about. And there's a couple things to bear in mind. First off, Luigi is correct. The Israelis, and this is the difference between the United States and Israel, the Israelis have a much looser interpretation of proportionality than does the United States. They are much more willing to accept higher levels of civilian casualties in pursuit of a military objective. But proportionate in the law of armed conflict refers to the force used versus the value of the military target. It doesn't mean that if Israel kills 100, or if Hezbollah kills 100 Israelis, Israel can only kill 100. It refers to the force used to take out the target. And given the nature of the target, which is elusive, and which has moved around, and given the fact that the protection afforded to the civilians was compromised by Hezbollah in putting their command bunker under that, I think that Israel has a strong case to make. And obviously they're losing the battle of international public opinion, but they have a strong case to make that this was a proportionate effort and the only way for them to do it, and that the condemnation, what Israel will say, is the condemnation for the civilian deaths is properly directed at those who chose to put a military target underneath the civilian apartment building.
Luigi, do you accept that it's actually Hezbollah's fault for building its bunkers and other dwellings underneath civilian areas?
I accept that there are tactics by all non-state armed groups in the world which fight asymmetrical wars to also embed among civilians. However, we should never forget that the alternatives of feasibility are also legally relevant. For example, in a scenario like Gaza, there are structural constraints of the urban battlefield. It's not that we can ask two armed groups to fight from the sea, for example. So we shouldn't conflate these with human shielding. Also, even when armed groups, terrorist groups, use human shields, this doesn't relieve attackers from distinction, proportionality, and precautions obligations. What we have seen in the military policies of the IDF unraveling in Gaza is that basically every civilian object has been in-premised assumed to be a human shield, and therefore a lawful target. This is not admissible under the law of war and might overcome the threshold for war crimes.
David, given that President Joe Biden halted the sale and export of 2,000-pound bombs to Israel earlier this year for fear of them killing more civilians, particularly in the Rafah crossing, do you think that Israel is behaving out of lockstep with the United States by using them?
Yeah, well, there's two things to bear in mind. First off, the battlefield in Lebanon is very different from the battlefield in Gaza. So, as Luigi rightly points out, the population seeking to avoid being stuck between Hamas and Israel has very limited options in Gaza, and Hamas perhaps has very limited place that it can put its military facilities, although they've made deliberate choices, I would argue. But in Lebanon, it's different. Hezbollah is the de facto government of South Lebanon, has the run of the area, and quite frankly, has a large number of military facilities that are not located in population areas. They have much more freedom of maneuver than in Gaza. The question about the 2,000-pound bombs, I think, was mostly political. Israel has large war stocks, and I think that the shipment did not really affect what Israel did. They were able to substitute with another munition. The challenge is, getting back to my first question, where when you talk about specific weapons performances, you come across looking very cold-hearted, and that's the burden I'm prepared to take on. But if you deny them the use of penetrating munitions, then the chances are that Israel would have pursued the objective with point detonating munitions. And in that instance, rather than gravity forcing the bomb through the building, what you get is a point detonating thing that you'd have to have multiple strikes that would probably result in far greater damage to the buildings around the building where the bunker was situated in order to do that. So I think that the initial embargo had only a political effect. It had minor operational effect on the Israeli forces, and probably was done more for purposes of signaling both to the Israeli government as well as to some of the electorate within the Democratic Party.
David Des Roches, Luigi Daniele, thank you both very much for your analysis today. Much appreciated. Let's hear from Anthony Lowenstein now, an investigative reporter who was based in Israel for several years. He wrote The Palestine Laboratory, in which he accuses Israel of using Gaza as a testing ground for weapons.
The Palestine Laboratory, the title of my book, really explains how for decades and decades, very much since Israel's birth in 1948, but it certainly accelerated after 1967, when Israel took control of the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. So the occupation there is close to 60 years now, has been using Palestinians as guinea pigs to find new innovative ways to control Palestinians. And that's bad enough for Palestinians, of course. But what Israel has been doing for those decades is using that experience and those new weapons and surveillance tools and in the modern age drones, and selling and promoting them to a massive global audience as so-called battle tested. And I document in the book, and the evidence is overwhelming, that this has been a key part of the Israeli playbook. I don't think Israel is occupying Palestinians simply to sell weapons. They're doing it for their perceived strategic benefit, although obviously I fundamentally oppose the occupation and have for years. But a key part of the occupation has been being able to make huge amounts of money from it. And it's been incredibly profitable. And I estimate that there are at least 140 countries on the planet, so the majority of nations on Earth, in the last decades that have bought some form of Israeli surveillance tech or drones or spyware. And that's led Israel to be the 9th or 10th biggest arms dealer in the world, which is pretty remarkable for a remarkably small country.
Anthony Lowenstein there. Now, we asked at the top of the programme, who's making money out of all this carnage? If you guessed US weapons makers, you'd be right, of course, but they're not the only ones to be benefiting.
We stand with Israel. We stand with Israel.
When the US president stands by his allies, he's essentially making a pledge on behalf of the country that must be paid for by the American taxpayer. And boy, do they pay. Under Joe Biden, the annual defense budget has swollen to a record $911 billion. That's about $2,600 for every man, woman and child in America. Now, about half the US defense budget goes to maintaining the US military, paying the salaries of soldiers and other expenses. The other half is spent buying weapons and services from private companies like Lockheed Martin, RTX, Boeing, General Dynamics and Northrop Grumman. These are the so-called Big Five US defense manufacturers who get the lion's share of government contracts. They make fighter jets, armoured vehicles, drones and other types of weapons and equipment, including the key components for Israel's missile defense system, the Iron Dome.
We're surging additional military assistance, including ammunition and interceptors, to replenish Iron Dome. We're going to make sure that Israel does not run out of these critical assets.
The US defense sector as a whole receives over $400 billion a year from the US government and manages to sell another $200 billion worth of weapons to other countries. These companies are so profitable that they can afford to pay their CEOs well over $20 million a year. They can also afford to hire lobbyists, lots of them. According to one report, the entire defense sector employs about 700 of them, which is more than one per member of Congress. About 3/4 of these lobbyists once worked for the federal government and are nicknamed revolvers for reasons best explained by Senator Elizabeth Warren, who's very suspicious of the entire sector.
So right now they have built this great revolving door between the Department of Defense and the big contractors. And they want that revolving door to keep spinning because it helps them with their profits.
And with those profits, they can afford to donate millions of dollars to members of Congress. And as they say in Washington, the president proposes, Congress disposes. In other words, Biden may ask for a massive defense budget, but it's Congress that votes to decide how big that budget is. America gives to Israel $3.8 billion every year to spend on US weapons. Some of the money will almost certainly end up with the Big Five. Just look at the company's share prices. Ever since Hamas attacked Israel on October the 7th, 4 out of 5 of them have risen sharply, which is good news for shareholders, including big names like State Street, BlackRock and Vanguard. It all goes to prove the adage that war is good for business. No one made that point more powerfully than President Dwight Eisenhower in his prophetic farewell address to the nation.
This conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
Okay, David Des Roches is still with us, and we're also joined by Raed Jarrar, a political advocate who has worked as a lobbyist on political issues pertaining to US engagement in the Arab world. Welcome to both of you. So, David, Dwight Eisenhower there making the point that we must beware the power of the military-industrial complex, for they may become too powerful and subvert American democracy. I would argue that probably has happened.
Well, there is a point to be made there, but a couple of key caveats. First off, he was speaking about the role in domestic politics. Secondly, if you look at the relative performance and strength of the defense industry in the United States, it's contracted drastically since the end of the Cold War, from about 40 major firms to 7 or 8, and generally underperforms the S&P 500. And then finally, specifically with regards to Israel, Israel is the only country in the world that U.S. military assistance goes to fund domestic developments of Israeli weapons. So the security assistance to Israel actually produces weapons that compete with the Americans' arms sector. So it actually, in this specific instance, and only in this instance, it works in opposition to the U.S. military-industrial complex. So it's a little bit more nuanced than is commonly known.
All those donations to politicians, hundreds of lobbyists, they're in it to win it.
Well, everybody's in it to win it, and there are vast competing things. And of course, I think what has the bigger impact is any industrial undertaking provides jobs in constituencies. But again, in the specific case of Israel, the United States taxpayers in the unique position of actually funding competitors to the American defense industrial complex. So it's based on something a little bit more, I would argue, affinity rather than the dark arts of lobbying.
Raed, the US weapons makers too powerful?
Very powerful. In Washington, D.C., where I live, all special interest groups are too powerful to make our democracy work well, whether these are lobbyists of weapon manufacturers or lobbyists for other special interests, foreign lobbyists, even some domestic issues in the United States. Unfortunately, in the past few days, while the world is watching the Middle East go on fire, we saw that the stock market, value for weapon manufacturers in the U.S. went up. So, there is definitely someone happy about more war, more destruction, and there is someone pushing for more war and more destruction because they're making more money out of it.
Well, that's true. The share prices of those big five weapons makers have gone up a lot over the past year. David, it seems to me that they have every incentive to try to push a US foreign policy towards confrontation and war.
Well, that is a common argument really since the end of World War I, and there were congressional hearings in the 1930s that this theory of the merchants of death. But there's a couple things. First off, in contrast to most other developed countries, the United States, it's very, very difficult to export weapons. There's an extreme amount of scrutiny, and it's more hassle than for any other production. We have an Arms Export and Control Act, not a Propagation Act. Most countries, Sweden cannot produce a fighter jet unless it exports them. Their own armed forces are not big enough to justify the research and development. The second thing is, if you look over time, you'll see that weapons manufacturing significantly underperforms the S&P 500 and most of the stock market. And the big debate right now, in light of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is some sort of state intervention saying, look, if we run these on a for-profit basis, we're going to see further contraction. We're going to see the loss of facilities. So we need to basically look at these as national assets, as happens in, say, France and Britain. So I think that you can always find somebody profiting from anything, given that the stock market is a series of bets on how the future would go. And when you have war in the world, it seems logical to suppose that weapons manufacturers will make more money. But it's a boom and bust cycle that responsible investors wouldn't predicate action on.
Raed, you don't mind me mentioning you're an Arab American, and I wanted to ask you, from your perspective, seeing the Muslim population of the United States growing, do you think that it's more likely that protests coming from that particular demographic, and others, of course, who are sympathetic, will have any effect on the US foreign policy with regards to funding and supplying arms for Israel?
Yeah, of course. I mean, as you mentioned, the protest does not only come from Arab Americans and Muslim Americans. These demographics, somehow overlap in the United States. More than half of Arab Americans are not Muslim. The majority of Muslim Americans are not Arab. So there is a lot of overlapping demographics here. But it's not really an Arab or a Muslim issue per se. It is a U.S. public issue. If you look at public polls coming from the United States, there is definitely a good majority of Americans who are worried about the direction that our country is moving in when it comes to supporting foreign dictatorships, sending weapons to the abusive regimes around the world in the Middle East. So it's two main things. The first of them is a better foreign policy that centers human rights. The second of them, which I think is even more important, is adhering to the United States law while sending weapons abroad. And I think Dave touched on that. We have a couple of laws, the Arms Export Control Act. Yeah. There is the Foreign Assistance Act that has very important, very strong, significant amendments, the Leahy Law or Amendment 620M, there's 620I. So these are very, very strong, binding U.S. law that has been violated by our own government by sending weapons to abusive regimes around the world, by sending weapons to those armed forces who have been committing gross violations of human rights.
David,
so these
just a very
voices
quick
are
response,
getting louder and louder.
Well, I don't want to disagree. What I want to do is amplify. So first off, the cleavage is not really amongst Arab Americans or Muslim Americans. It's really an age cleavage. People of my age who grew up in the Cold War speak of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and you're sympathetic with the Israelis in that because it's a small country surrounded by a lot of Arabs. People who are younger than me often speak of the Israel-Palestine conflict, and there the Palestinians are David and Israel is Arab. So that's point A. It's a generational. It's not really an ethnic division. The second point I would make is that this is a problem. The use of weapons is a problem not just with Israel, but with many, many countries. Even, during the Troubles in Northern Ireland, the United Kingdom, our closest ally, there were calls constantly from people in the American public and in Congress to stop defense cooperation and weapons shipments to the United Kingdom because of supposed abuses against Northern Ireland. And this taps into a strong strain of American isolationism. You opened with Dwight David Eisenhower's valedictory address. I will hearken back to George Washington, where he said, beware of foreign entanglements. So we always have a tension between supporting countries that might advance our interests, but then if those countries do something wrong with the support we provide them, we feel morally responsible for that. That tension has never really been resolved satisfactorily.
David Des Roches, thank you so much. And Raed Jarrar, thank you as well. I'm afraid we've run out of time. And thank you at home and on your phones for watching. If you want to see this episode or any of our previous episodes, do go to our channel on YouTube. Just type in Nexus TRT World. Till next week then, goodbye.